we know now every election year, everything's about the election.
Absolutely.
Everything that happens, all the news you're getting, one way or other, it's trying to shape, mold, mind shaping, molding into going with a particular candidate. I was going to call it the elephant in the room, but that's probably political to say that. But there's
the donkey in the room.
There's this tension, because a lot of Christians say, well, I want to vote for whoever the best Christian is. Well, sometimes you get no Christian. You may have someone who has basic moral ethics or understanding, but to get to the level that they're at, we both know that there's a lot of compromise that's been happening along the way, and not that you can't be a Christian, but I look at it and I think, I'm not voting for the pastor, I'm not voting for a priest, I'm not voting for a nun, I'm voting for a secular leader in a Christianized culture, if we could say that, that will take us to where we need to go. And so, my thoughts were, because this election especially, we've got two incomplete, difficult candidates for various reasons. And I think that's kind of obvious to everyone. So everyone's asking, white people, black people, Hispanic people, Asians are all saying, who do I vote for, And I've been telling people, don't think of the individual, think of where you believe they're going to take us. So we're going ahead prophetically and looking at a destination. What is the so-called city of God in our future? Who's taking us at least in that direction? How are you processing this, and how do you feel that those in the black community are processing this entire
Well, I
year?
think right now, speaking from the African American perspective, that the African Americans have always had what we call a survival issue here in America. You had second-class citizenship, you had segregated housing, you had unemployment and underemployment and all of that. So survival issue has always been African Americans' issues, and today it's even for them worse. In the minds of African American, it's a painful situation right now. It's painful. And so when you...
What does that pain look like?
When you talk about the coronavirus, in the black community, we are subjected to, higher rates and higher death per population. And, we talk about, we have certain illnesses and we don't believe that's necessarily true. When it comes down to healthcare, there's healthcare disparities. When it comes down to employment, there's employment disparities and other kinds of issues. And so for black people, this candidate has to agree to, helping African Americans survive. When you think in terms of businesses, when you think in terms of economic empowerment into African American communities, it's not there. When you talk about racism, it's still there. I could mention a lot of places, but I'm sure you're familiar with all of those places. And so for African Americans, it's about survival. And then you can't add insult to injury for them. So, you can't, talk just about the injury and then actually go into the even personal insults. This country has proven that it has the highest rate of prison rate in the world. And yet it's the most prosperous country in the world. And I can name many other problems. So the candidate for African American has to deal with this survival issue. And you can't add insult to it either. This is serious for them.
So there's high level sensitivity as they're listening to particularly Biden and Trump, like who feels like they really care about who we are and where we're going to go.
Well, I really don't think that African Americans care about who cares about them, because they have heard that song for so long.
Right.
They actually want to know who is going to produce for them.
Okay,
it is
good.
about action. And for them, action speaks louder than words.
So do they look at a history then and say, what will President Biden look like as opposed to President Trump?
Absolutely. And so, when you look at policing and all of the killings that you have, and it's very clear, this young man, 17-year-old young man, goes out and shoots, and suddenly you say, well, maybe he's not a bad guy.
Right.
And the other folk are victimized. When you look at, in Louisville, they just settled that suit there with $12 million. But when you look at the young lady who was killed, well, maybe it was just an accident. But for far too long, as you pointed out, a sort of lynching has always occurred in America, and with the social media piece, it causes African Americans to see that. So here's what the real issue is. Presidents have one major issue, one major concern, and that is setting the tone for the country. So when you think in terms of John F. Kennedy, or when you think in terms of Ronald Reagan or whatever president, it's about setting the tone. He doesn't do all the work. He appoints people, but it's about setting a tone nationally. Who is going to set the better tone morally and spiritually for us, and equally in this country?
And so obviously, historically, that leads very heavily toward the Democratic Party, whoever the candidate is. Somehow that's the interpretation, is that Democrats over the past 40 to 50 years have attended more to those things. Is that?
Well, I mean, it appears as if the Democrats have a greater social agenda,
Sure.
that points towards all people, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not necessarily so. Prior to 1963, most African Americans were Republicans, and they stood for the causes of Republicans. Of course, when you had a decision over a man who's going to show the tone of the nation being, now we're going to look at integration, or now we're going to look at civil rights, voting rights, you had John F. Kennedy said, I'm going to consider that. You had Richard Nixon said, well, I'm still a Republican, and I still believe in the former. And so I'm not.
So is the Civil Rights Act the kind of the dividing line?
Yeah, well, I mean, Martin King was in jail there in, I believe it was Birmingham, and, Coretta says, hey, can you get us out? And John F. Kennedy says, yeah, we can do something, about that. And once John F. Kennedy got King out of the Birmingham jail cell, suddenly his dad said, hey, let's all vote for John F. Kennedy again. And so for them, Kennedy was setting the tone for African Americans.
Sure.
Okay? And, we know that Kennedy still has some problems with racism and discrimination. I mean, the caring, is a human aspect, but as you're saying, we need a president who is going to act versus, get all emotional with us. It's about survival issue for black people right now. And you want to get emotionally tied to love and all of that. We're not interested in that. We're interested in you shifting legislation. What is it that Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson did? He shifted legislation that had to do with the fact that there was a group of people who were left out, civil rights and voting right violation. And ultimately, King was going to say, even in fair employment issue, Poor People's Campaign.
But there was a very strong vote for the Civil Rights Act. As far as Republicans and Democrats, it seemed like there was a great kind of a full feel like this is the right thing to do.
Well, we would say, during Eisenhower administration, the black leadership went into the president's office back then and said, hey, we need civil rights legislation, we need voting rights legislation. And it is reported that Eisenhower responded to them, make me.
Really?
Make me. And what he was saying is what actually Martin King did. He said to President Kennedy, we need this legislation. And basically Kennedy said, make me. So King said, fine. We'll put 250,000 people out there, black, white, and brown, to say we need the legislation.
That was good.
And once he went out there on August 28th, that hot day in Washington, D.C., and had the March on Washington, he and the other six civil rights leaders were invited to the office of President Kennedy, where Kennedy said, well, you made me today. I heard you had a dream.
Because it's interesting, and I've studied this a little bit, obviously not like you, but because I've always been intrigued with it. I mean, Lincoln was a Republican.
Absolutely.
Whether he was a Republican like Republicans are now or not, You know, I've seen the movie.
Right.
You know, and I look at it and go, wow, it's really interesting how they process things in Washington, you know. But, you know, it was Republicans and generally the North during the Civil War that were really, you know, there was a lot of issues they were fighting for, but slavery was a big issue, the biggest, really. You know, there was an economic component to it, but the North stood strong. The North was dominant. The North won the war. And, you know, that started to obviously shift the tide in a good way, really worldwide. It started to shift during that time. But again, I don't think we properly handled the post-Civil War, particularly with African Americans, former slaves and families that now, you know, a lot of them went into the city, couldn't get jobs, so they went back to their former masters. And in some ways, there was a replay of slavery again. They were getting very minimal money and right under the same oppression they were in before. And that went on for decades, you know, really right up to Martin Luther King. So I look at it and I go, I wonder at times why African Americans, because there is, the other little component that's in there is abortion. And abortion, I've talked to so many black pastors about this, and they never answer me directly on it. Why abortion is not I wouldn't say it's not a key issue. It hasn't been enough of an issue to push them out of the Democratic Party toward more of a conservative or Republican view. What are your thoughts on that, like regarding abortion and how that affects politics?
Let me make just 2 comments about what you said in the case of Abraham Lincoln. In the case of Abraham Lincoln said that if I have to free every slave to save the nation, I will. And if I have to keep every slave enslaved for the nation, I will. And what actually Abraham Lincoln was saying was that the nation was bigger than any of our issues. So it was about saving the nation.
Yes.
And I think that needs to be the perspective of every American today. It's about the nation. The nation is bigger than any president, any legislator, any senator or congressperson. And for me, even the church in essence, you know, I don't mean Jesus Christ, but
right.
The nation is bigger. And secondly, as one historical author said, during the post-slavery day Reconstruction period, it was the first time that African Americans had ever been unemployed. They were fired. As you say, they left the slave fields. They were supposed to be promised 40 acres and a mule. Truth of the matter is they didn't get the 40 acres, neither mule, and they were fired. In the case of the abortion issue, I take the position of Billy Graham again, as listening to him just the other day. Billy Graham said that he was not for abortion, except for in the case of violent rape, and in the case of a life.
Save a life.
Save a life, absolutely. He said in that case, he is for abortion. What black people are saying...
Which would be less than probably 3%. I saw the stats on it. It was 2 something.
That's right.
Yeah, it's a very small number. Yeah.
Very small number. What black people are saying, and I think whites are saying it now, that we ought not to be concerned about what happens prior to the womb, okay, in aborting or not aborting. We ought to be concerned about what happens from the womb to the tomb. And what is happening is we're more concerned about the life of children versus the entire life of people. So what difference is it for you to, quote unquote, kill a baby in the womb and then kill all of these African Americans and other group of people outside of the womb, okay? You know, and the real expression of that was actually George Floyd, when folk were saying, and those were good white brothers and sisters and blacks who were saying, hey, how long are you gonna stay on the man's neck? Get off the man's neck. And so what African Americans and other ethnic, like Latino, are saying, be concerned about what happens out of the womb. So you're so concerned about aborting inside of the womb, but you're not so concerned about the aborting outside of the womb, where you have unemployment, you have educational disparity, health disparity, housing disparity, you know, all because of something that is so insignificant. And would you like to know what that insignificant piece is? You're discriminating only because of one's color, texture of hair, size of nose, and lips, which were actually created by God to help those people to adapt to certain climate. So
Right.
Africans have black nose because they needed more air in this hot weather, you know?
Right.
Their hair needed to breathe, and so over a period of time, it got to a certain texture. White's hair is laid down because they came out of a cold weather environment, Europe. So they needed to keep their hair warm, so God set it where it lays down. They didn't need take in all of that air. And so their nose became, and their complexion had to, you know, black people had to deflect the sun, white folk had to take in, you know. And so these are minor differences.
Of course.
At the end of the day, God says we're all of the same blood.